For more than a decade, Russia has pumped poison into the bloodstream of our civilization in the form of hypnotic lies and myths that Stephen Douglas calls disinfolklore. These human-crafted mythical falsehoods are a form of simplistic yet impactful fairy tale nonsense. They fooled many foreign policy professionals, politicians, diplomats, as well as lay people into repeating patently absurd yet endlessly recycled bogus Russian narratives. There is a strategic purpose behind the contemporary Russian disinfolklore, says Stephen, to prevent allies coming to the aid of Ukraine, to provide it what it needs, and to enforce its inherent right to self-defense. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to see more fantastic speakers and content. Do consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee to support the work of the channel. Before you do that, however, do have a look at the incredible Ukrainian charities, the links to which are in the description of the video. Stephen Douglas is a self-described expert in combat propaganda and is a former diplomat. He's the creator of Decoding Trolls and Disinfolklore. The latter has been described in a Byline Times review as a brilliant new analytical method to parse and counter disinformation. Stephen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start with an absolutely arresting image, and I'm going to ask you about the beginnings of disinfolklore, the sort of fairy tale origins, or I say very dark sort of fairy tale, and then we'll get on to the analytical method itself. But we're going to insert an incredible image into the video here, and this is a bridge which you were involved in, and it was a bridge between Russian-held territory and Ukrainian-held territory after the initial invasion of Donbass in 2014. Could you give a bit of a description of how this all started and that mystical place that that really was so significant in developing your ideas?
That's right, Jonathan. Yes, I was posted as an OSCE diplomat to a bridge in eastern Ukraine. It was the only official crossing point between government-controlled Ukraine and Russia-occupied Luhansk. And I was sent there in January 2015. So that's about 8 months after Russia first invaded Ukraine in late March 2014. And this bridge was the only connection between Russia-occupied Luhansk and government-controlled Ukraine, and about 10,000 civilians passed across this space each day. And my job there, along with 25 colleagues, was to ensure the safe passage of these civilians from Russia-occupied Luhansk, which I call the House of Lies, and Ukrainian government-controlled territory, which I call the House of Songs, a democracy. And the Donets River, which is adjacent to the Don River, and since antiquity, this marked the border between Asia and Europe. So if you look at Isidore of Seville's 5th century map, you will see the Don divides Europe from Asia. So this is an intersection zone for millennia, and I was there at this moment in time when on one side you had the Ukrainian army defending this territory and to stop the Russian occupiers from coming over the river. And from the very first moment of being there, I had this intuition about there was something folklore about the situation. So it's in the middle of a biosphere reserve, a forest. There was this river, it was a bridge, and most famous troll tales in our culture emanate from this troll tale that was first written down in about 1870 in Norwegian folklore, where 3 goats try to cross a bridge which is guarded by a troll. And I'm not going to ruin the ending for you there on that story, but I had to deal with the Russian occupiers each day, and they used to troll my emotions. And I tried not to troll theirs, but basically to try and get their words into my reports, which I would then send to Vienna, to my bosses in Vienna. And I realized there was some sense of continuity between how they trolled my emotions with these stories about heroic battles they had fought the night before. I would arrive there first thing in the morning to find out what had happened the night before. There was a continuity between that and what was going on in our information space with the phenomenon of trolling on Facebook and Trump. And I realized this is the same thing. Artillery is firing from that side to this side. It's making me feel scared or frightened, or it's making me feel angry. That's the same emotion I feel if I see a particular informational unit on Facebook or something that is trolling. And so out of this environment was born this quest to try and understand what is folklore about this, and disinfolklore as an idea, and as a mode of seeing. It's a way of seeing propaganda. It's a way of perceiving how Russian propaganda affects our minds and our cognition. It's a way of understanding how disinfolklore inculcates rules into us about what to think. We become depressed about Ukraine or about this or about that. We become we lose our agency. And this is all done through newspapers, media, stories, which, although they are very different from the folklore we read as children, they are operating in exactly the same way in our minds. They're teaching us not to go to the forest. They're teaching us this troll is dangerous. They're teaching us not to get into the car. They're teaching us not to arm Ukraine. They're teaching us to just hold back because there might be nuclear war. So yeah, that's the origins of it.
And there's a carrot and stick aspect to it, because on the one hand, you've got, don't do this because there'll be terrible consequences, nuclear war, etc. On the other hand, there's another narrative, which is we actually want peace. It's really designed to confuse people, a little bit like this story of if you beat a dog one day and are kind to it the next, you're going to mess with its psychology so much that the animal's going to not only do anything you want and be completely in awe of you, but it's also going to go pretty mad with that inconsistent behavior. So you have this other side of the Russian propaganda structure saying, but we wanted peace in early 2022, but you guys, you didn't sign up to it, and Minsk one, Minsk two, Minsk three, we've been after peace all along, and they broke it, etc. So you've got these two sides, but you also describe action on the ground. So you've got these narratives, and it'd be good to sort of deconstruct some of those in a minute and see how coordinated they are, because they don't just arise accidentally or organically. And this troll on the bridge, he didn't invent any of this stuff. He's clearly getting it from somewhere. But it'd be useful to unpack, how those narratives that are saying one thing, and then, as you say, you've got shells coming over. So you've got this physical terror, which is often at variance to the stories that are being told. Be interesting to know how that sort of messed with your psyche, and of course, the Ukrainians and your colleagues as well.
Starting in the here and now, where we hear what you mentioned about peace. So for me, it's relatively easy for me to understand that the mana, the energy inside all of this, and this is key to disinfolklore, is trying to help us look for the energy, what I call mana, M-A-N-A, in memes, whether they're linguistic, visual, whether they're in the New York Times or from Lavrov, or from our mother or our best friend or an expert on disinformation. And the mana of Russian disinfolklore is coercive control. So some of us will understand, anyone who lives in England will understand it's now unlawful to exercise coercive control over a person. But we all understand anecdotally how wife beaters work. And this kind of, I'm really sorry, I'll never do it again. And as you were saying there, this kind of ping pong of it's real, it's not real, oh, sorry, we want peace, we want war, all of this. That is the manner of coercive control. And whenever we recognize this in our information space, then that is in itself evidence that we're in a disinfolklore world. And if it's in terms of Russian disinfolklore. It's clearly Russian disinfolklore, but it works in all authoritarian dialect, in all authoritarian discourses. So it's relatively easy for me because for 3 years, every day I was gathering, collecting, and reporting on evidence of the breaches of Minsk 1 and 2. I posted a bit about at Decoding Trolls on X, where I use these photographs that I took and I mark them and I show this is evidence that Russia was breaching the Minsk 2 peace agreements, because they should have been on the north side of the Donets River here. But here, actually, they have a position on the south side of the river, where I used to go each day and deal with this forester, this self-confessed simple forester who, when I first went there in early 2015, they were raggle-taggle. They were the green men. They were the little green men. So again, this folkloric trope, which disarms you because they're just little green men. So, I mean, and if Ukrainians are being beaten by little green men, then clearly they're these kind of folkloric articles. They're like little leprechauns or things. So when I hear about the Russian peace or their peace proposals, I know it's a lie, and I'm looking in this kind of stereo peace, not peace, peace, not peace, and I look for this manner of coercive control, and we can use this as an indicator of their bona fides or what they mean. And in disinfolklore, if you see this, you know you're not dealing with people who are acting in good faith.
And something we were talking about before we hit record is I think you call it slow genocide or subtle genocide, which is essentially, not doing the sort of, Hitler, it's all out there, right? This is what we're going to do. And it's fairly sort of blatant, or I assume it was fairly blatant to most people at the time. This is a more kind of insidious form of genocide, which is saying, you are persecuted, and actually convincing people that they're genuinely persecuted and there's generally a genocide against them when there isn't. So this would be, Ukrainians enacting a genocide in Donbass against Russian speakers, which is one of the big pretexts for the invasion. That didn't happen. There were problems in laws that were perhaps clumsily enabled to try and get Ukrainian as the I would say the administrative language of the country. And there are some fairly good reasons why you'd want to do that, because, of course, Russia weaponizes language. But out of these, I would say, sort of civic struggles, Russia has been able to craft a narrative of genocide, and under cover of that narrative, actually commit a genocide, which is the opposite of what that story they've spun actually is. When did you become aware of that, and what indicators really started to flag that for you?
Well, I mean, it's a core tenet. I write about this a lot, that we often think disinformation or disinfolklore happens to other people, happens to stupid people, people who aren't educated, non-Ukrainians, Ukrainians, or people who've been to university. But it's a core tenet that the moment you start to think that, we need to check, as the Dalai Lama would put it. That is the moment when you become susceptible to it, because we are all susceptible to it. And in the Russist combat, and I'm going to use the term Russist because I have nothing against Russians, as none of us do, but a Russist is somebody who believes in imperial Russism and believes in the genocide in Ukraine. A Russist will have different vectors. So I talk in terms of vectors rather than narratives, because you have a meaning. The meaning is we will kill all Ukrainians, or we will win the war in Ukraine. And the vectors are just thousands of articles telling us to lay down our arms. Ukraine can never win. Russia will keep on going forever like a transformer. And they have vectors for everyone from President Biden's things. They have them for Vatniks. They have them for people that I still know in Eastern Ukraine, who are ardent Ukrainian patriots today and will fight to the death to defend their land and their villages from it. But the Russians are still targeting them with these vectors, which will manipulate their minds and their, as the French would say, their volonté, their motivation, their intentions. So you start reading the article and you're thinking, I support Ukraine, Ukraine will win. But by the end of it, this New York Times or New York Times journalist is telling you Ukraine can't win. Oh, so we must make peace. So it's really important, for me anyway, to always remember that I'm just as susceptible to it than others. I've just created this set of routines, mental routines, which help me see through it and see where my mind is being affected. So that's just a precursor. So I happen to have I studied international law at Cambridge University, which is famous for international law. And I was inside what I now understand was a genocide. I've read Primo Levi, I studied the Holocaust. I went to Auschwitz and Dachau and different places. I'm a great scholar of the Holocaust, and yet I found myself inside a genocide for 3 years, ground zero of a genocide, and I never realized I was in it. In fact, I didn't realize it until I marked the moment on X at Decoding Trolls on the 1st of March 2022, and I realized, oh my God, this is what they were doing. They were preparing the ground for genocide all the time, and how they did this in this amazing information space that was literally, it's like, I liken it to an IKEA kit that was brought from Moscow into Russia-occupied territories, and it's unpacked. Some of it looks really clumsy. It's like newspapers, it's letters, it's radio stations, it's online, 30 different online broadcasts. It's television that looks, production values that looks like it's CNN, to really Soviet stuff, which, Jonathan, you'll remember from your time in Russia, just really old-fashioned gray man. And all of this, to my eyes, when I was there from early 2015, was, this is mad. I don't understand what they're doing. But imminent in it, the manner of all of this was to create this, and this is again where folklore comes in, and particularly in our culture, where they were creating this inner and outer realm. So we remember from these child stories, the king's castle, the kingdom, the countryside. So this inner outer realm, which is matched by geography. So there's a river, there's Russia-occupied Ukraine, and then there's Ukraine. And of course, inside Russia-occupied Ukraine, they call the Ukrainians the usurpers of the power, of the manna, of the kingdom. And so that's outer realm. And you create this sense of inner, outer realm. You get the geography, but you also do it by saying, Ukrainians are trying to kill you. And you begin in early 2014 thinking, I'm a Ukrainian. Why would the Ukrainians try to kill me? But it's everywhere. The entire universe of the space is telling you that Ukrainians are trying to kill you. And the vectors of this are a million stories every single day about mythical shellings, which never happened. I know they never happened because I was there when they were supposed to have happened. And even when I was right next to it, and this gets to one of your points, Jonathan, about how you verified, I was in situations where I heard the explosion. I saw a Ukrainian soldier polishing his RPG, which throws these grenades kind of thing. And I asked him, did you hear that explosion? He'd go, no. And then I go to Russia occupied across this bridge, and I suddenly meet a Russian like a senior officer, who immediately conducts me on this whole odyssey of showing me where they exploded, what exploded, the Ukrainians did it. And I see what looks like blood on the ground, but it's blackberry season, and tens of thousands of tons of blackberries have been brought across this border. And so everything looks like blood on the ground. And then for weeks afterwards in the media, they're talking about the Ukrainians killed 3 people. And so you could not have been closer to these explosions than me in actuality, but I don't know whether they happened. I don't know whether anyone was injured. I heard stories, 2 people brought to hospital, 2 not. And when you zoom out of this, you're left with stuff in the information space that you read on Twitter, or you hear it in a Trump rally, or any of these things, and you're thinking, did this really happen? I don't know. And so how do I discern whether it matters whether it happened or not? And if I'm looking at it that people are creating this sense of other, it's this what I call stealth genocide, and this is core in Disinfolklore, because this is what the Russians um, were up to. And I checked this yesterday, actually. President Zelensky used the term genocide on the 5th of April, 2022, for the first time. And like me, President Zelensky is an international lawyer, so you don't use the word genocide lightly. And the president of Poland used the term on around the 15th of March, 2022. And I had already noticed in Ukraine, I used, before Disinfolklore was born, I used this, you would often see these protests, what I call these fake demonstrations. And I was able to discern, is this from a genuine organic demonstration of villagers annoyed that the gas has been cut off, and so they're blocking the road, which is a model of protest that applies in that part of the world. Is it real, or is it provoked by Russian agents? And one of the indicators I used was they would liken, some issue over the gas to genocide. This is genocide. And same thing with vaccinations and all of these things. We're looking in Ireland at the moment with these protests, far right protests about immigration. It's always about immigration. This is the manner of Russian disinfolklore. It's about borders, inner outer realm. Let's protect the inner realm of England from the outer realm Syrians. They're males, they're dark, they're going to come in. And Russia, as we know, for instance, carpet bombed Syria in the autumn of 2015. So it's a totally integrated product. They create the refugee crisis, 1 million migrants to North Macedonia, and then they either fund or directly, or say in the case of in Poland, where you have very antithetical government to Russianism and see through it all, but they still benefited from the 2015 refugee crisis. So this, but it's for the Russians, it's all tied into what I call the stealth genocide, which is now we see it in plain sight, those of us who are tuned into what's going on in Ukraine. But the preparatory moment to it was from 2015 and to 2022. And I had a ringside seat to it. And despite all my vaunted education, I didn't realize it. I didn't realize I was in a genocide. And I liken it to this. I use this example a lot where I say, it's 1942. At the end of your garden, there's a railway track, and you see the cattle cars going by on the way to Auschwitz. Do you know you're witnessing genocide? Of course you don't. You're just seeing a moment in it. And I was always scanning for these signs in Ukraine, 2015, 2022. Never imagined I was part of it. I was participant. I was a character in this folkloric element. And now we see its fruition. So yeah, that's what I mean by stealth genocide. It's a core.
And as a methodology, I mean, this seems to me important, and we'll talk about ontologies in a minute, because this is a big thing that I've been trying to sort of understand. These narratives, of course, come in every shape and size. They're crafted for everybody in the audience at different times. And even though they might be completely contradictory, they're being thrown out because they know that this particular narrative might work with a particular person at a particular time. Another one will work with someone else. Doesn't matter if they're contradictory, as long as you don't follow the breadcrumbs. And again, to use the sort of, the sort of fairy tale, as long as you don't follow the breadcrumbs back to the source, and you're just seeing this isolated narrative that influences you in the moment, it kind of works. And doesn't this also play off one of the weaknesses in the media? Because the media is very much about what's happening in the here and now. It takes a particular message or a particular narrative or event, and it reports on it. Whereas what you're describing here is a process that if you're going to unpick it and have some kind of, I would say, almost immunity against it, you have to follow the breadcrumbs back. You have to say, okay, this particular author or this story or this narrative, what is its provenance? When did it start? How was it amplified? What were the different routes through which it was propagated? that might start to give you an understanding of whether it's an organic story or narrative and can be treated in a normal political sense, or whether it's actually had an origin and intent behind it. Is one of the weaknesses here that the media doesn't do that. And it doesn't even take, for instance, we're now seeing, I won't name names here, but we're now seeing a number of advisors um, who seem to be helping to form the White House policy in regards to Ukraine. And some of that policy is extremely detrimental to Ukraine, the sort of drip feeding of weapons, holding back certain munitions. To you and I, this starts to feel like a Russian narrative that's playing out because it results in inaction. It results in us not giving Ukraine what it needs. It benefits Russia. You take some of these experts who are now, being told they visited the White House 9 times in the last year, whereas I would say genuine experts, Charles and others, invited 0 times to the White House. And then you trace them back and you look at the full history of the articles they've written, and you can deconstruct semantic those articles and start to see consistencies of narrative in terms of not just, the stories they're telling, but the intent, as you mentioned earlier, the intent to prevent people from taking action, to give a multitude of reasons why you shouldn't do something rather than why you should. And then you trace them back even further and you find these speakers attended Valdai in Russia, or they have associations with, let's say, Moscow universities, or they were at a conference and they met so and so and so and so. There's these tangential kind of links, which when you combine it with a detailed analysis of their output, and as you say, the intent behind it, that would tell you something. But the media doesn't operate like that. So are we at a distinct advantage? And could you unpack how all this works?
I think so I'm quite optimistic. So I still believe there will be a moment when America goes all in. Germany has gone all in. And I marked the moment, I think it was in April 2023. It's too late. I marked the moment in a tweet I just saw yesterday on X. So I still believe America will go all in. Certainly, President Biden went all in a few days ago in his Valley Forge Street speech in the context of fighting Trump and Trumpism, and in pointing out that the theatricalness of Trump's use of the Jan 6th insurrectionists now in his rallies is, and President Biden referred to it as a fairy tale, a bad fairy tale. And then he went on to say, if you were reading about an ex-US president saying these things, saying that he'd pardon these insurrectionists, you'd think it was a bad novel. So President Biden gets this disinfolklore element, that these are just kind of stories. And I think what is going on with the Russian disinformation, as well as with what I call Trump Brexitism, which is a part of it, this Trump Brexit disinfolklore as well, is they are, through this carnival, through this P.T. Barnum spectacle, they are turning us in from agents, from voters, from electors, from participants in our own destiny. We have a human right of public participation in decision making. It's one of the core human rights. And what they're trying to do is using media to turn us from participants in this into watchers, into we just see the theatricalness of it, it's just over the top. Everything is over the top, and it's a dictum I came up with relatively recently, but it's basically the media is not mediating. The media is creating the reality. It is creating the reality, it is reporting the reality it is creating. But in many cases, it only exists as a phenomena on that particular medium at that moment. It doesn't correlate. So polling is used as this magical chrysanthemum to say, oh, so what is completely made up only exists in the minds is said, oh, polls say this and polls say that. But what that is actually, we are thinking of that this is reporting reality, but actually it is creating reality. And what also gives me optimism is that we have in President Zelensky a master, an absolute master of communication. So he, as we know, he was chief executive of the most significant privately held entertainment company in the post-Soviet space, arguably. He is an actor. In my experience of Eastern Ukraine, I got to know the actual building where he grew up. I used to go there to speak to an LGBTIQ group who operated out of there and who suddenly weren't getting persecuted by Russians, by Russia's infused far right when President Zelensky became president because there was police around. And so President Zelensky has probably one of the best ideas of how the narrative arc of this conflict. And obviously, with the resources all of us as individuals fighting for Ukraine in the information space have, and even Ukraine has, it's not enough to always defeat these vectors and these stories that are coming out. And so even this story, which I've seen as well, and the White House logs showing X and Y person has gone there to advise, and now I didn't understand what the word tanky was, and these are the Westerners who are sympathetic and empathetic, and I plead guilty as charged in certain moments of my life. But Crimea, the invasion of Crimea, did change everything, even before I ended up working there in my mind. But these tankies going there, the people who are willing to surrender our civilization to the big bad wolf, because the big bad wolf says if we don't, they'll do X and Y. And of course, it makes no sense. But they are, inside this, visiting the White House can itself be used as a story to depress sentiment. And the core tenet, where Zarina Zabriskie, who does great work and who actually studied philology in St. Petersburg. So I've gone back into linguistics, and it because I needed to understand what was going on in this world in Eastern Ukraine. And then I discovered that actually the Russians creating this content are philologists. And as part of your philology degree, which is an alien word in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, but linguistics, they study combat propaganda as part of their university course. And so I, almost by accident, have ended up in the realm of these particular sounds which work, like right, rit, rt, rach, Reich, these sounds which come from very deep Indo-European roots, meaning what is, RTA in Sanskrit, what is, and Russian Disinfolklore creates this artificial reality, and it tries to claim what is through the so there is a danger that even when we're reporting about these people visiting the White House, that we are as knowledgeable as us are, where our sentiment is being depressed. And so for me, an early insight for me was that when I feel my emotions being triggered, then I go on guard. So it's obviously hard to keep this watch on your mind, what's going into your mind. But when I feel my, fear, anger, disgust, sadness, happiness being triggered, then my aspiration, I don't always achieve this, whether it's on Twitter or watching TV or reading a newspaper or hearing a story like this, I try to see, okay, this is triggering my emotions. I'm on guard now. And I'm wondering, am I going to end up in the state of mind that who wants me to end up in this state of mind? And if it's depressed about Ukraine's prospect, if it's depressed about America, or whether America will go all in, then I realize the manner of that is Russian. That's benefiting them. On the other hand, when I hear President Zelensky's speech, or just talking, because he is the master communicator, and I feel happy, then I know this is CounterDisinfolklore. He's using this. And so I have this sense that they are, there's no better head of state to have who is this genius of communications. He studied Charles Chaplin. He knows how to provoke emotions. As he said recently, I spent most of my career trying to make Ukrainians laugh. And that was my raison d'etre. And now I'm trying to stop them from crying. And so you have this. So I liken it. I wrote early in March 2022. I said, let's compare trolls. And I wrote this piece about Putin. We see this as genius. No, he's a 20th century troll. He knows the mechanics of it. If I do this, if I torture this person, they will cry, they'll fear, they'll surrender, they'll be vulnerable. But President Zelensky is working on a much different level. He's a 21st century troll. He has the full control is in these sounds going in there, of his emotions and the effect of his emotions, because he created these works of art. I mean, it was quite bawdy and populist stuff, but they were able to leverage a way of making comedy. And of course, he got into comedy, and Privy Ree, maybe you've been there, Jonathan. I've been there a lot, and it's a rough place. It's a tough place. He grew up in a place. His parents were and are academics, but they grew up in a really tough town, and he used humor from the beginning to avoid getting beaten up. And then they turned this in this entrepreneurial way. And this is again why I'm optimistic, is because Ukraine have their core competency is you give them X and they'll turn it into this universe of amazing things. Give them a few javelins and they'll defeat the second army of the world. They'll push them back from Kharkiv, from Kherson, from Kiev. And President Zelensky and himself and his friends embody this characteristic of Ukrainians. And as many of us who love Russia and loved Russia and had spent a lot of time trying to understand Russia through its literature, often folklorically inspired, Dostoevsky's, but anyway, know that Russia doesn't have this core competency. So I suppose when we hear these stories, we become part of this story. We become a part of the spectacle. And if we can just withdraw a little bit and see if our emotions are triggered, then the disinfolklore perspective helps us see, because we have now the category, we go, is this disinfolklore or is this counter-disinfolklore? Everything NAFO does is counter-disinfolklore by definition. It's trying to make people laugh. It's countering this bad thing. It's in favor of defending the post-World War II order. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is, I mean, Putin, as you say, is crude. He's not, the intellectual or the expert at communications. He is perhaps by training good at manipulating people, manipulating them psychologically, and that was a core part of his KGB training, and we believe a core part of his actual profession there. That was infiltrating groups of so-called oppositionists or intellectuals or writers or whatever, or people who are protesting, to infiltrate them and then manipulate them into perhaps turning each other in and all this kind of stuff. So devious and unpleasant. But there's two different challenges here, aren't there? And different people sort of pulling the strings. So whereas Putin himself is crude, he has got a sort of master of communication, or he did have one. And prior to 2012, it was, prior to the full-scale war, it was far more subtle and effective than it has been perhaps recently. I mean, it's still effective, but it's cruder now. And that is Vladislav Surkov, or Surkov, the sort of the so-called magician of the Kremlin, and that there's a kind of subtlety behind his craft. There's a theatricality, but there's very different intent, isn't there? The Russian disinformation is mostly, not always, mostly designed to engender indifference and despair and prevent people from taking action. It's there to take away their agency. And that, in some ways, is perhaps an easier task than what Zelensky is faced with. He needs to encourage people to activate their agency, realize their agency, and then act upon it. That's a more challenging communications sort of problem to deal with, isn't it?
Absolutely. And now he has to try and do it not just for Ukrainians who are organically active in the sense that they understand they will be killed if they don't if they don't fight and keep on fighting. But of course, in the day, President Zelensky's daily nightly speeches are masterpieces in encouraging people to be active. So now President Zelensky is against this wall of many of our political leaders who now, and again, this is where the tiredness, which is itself exists on the narrative plane, and articles, earnest articles written about, oh, is the West getting sick of Ukraine? And the conclusion of the article might be no, but the actual immanent in the article, in the framing of it, in the subject matter, in the fact that they are writing this, is this, and it is these are exhibits in disinfolklore. They might talk to certain people. So it's like, and one person in the woods said this, and the other woman said that, and the person on the bridge said that. And the conclusion of it is, no, we're not tired at all, but we're embedding this this vector. And I mean, for me, one of the insights is in this word manipulate. So when we break it down, it's this mana, this energy out of which from which all our motivation, all our intentions flow. So we're not aware of it, that we even have this kind of subtle energy that is impacted by all sensory inputs. But Russian and Trump Brexit disinfolklore will affect our intentions and turn us from active participants in our own destiny to mere watchers, or we're watching how we're getting tired of Ukraine, when of course none of us living outside Ukraine have any right to be tired. We're not woken up by missile strikes, and so just the whole idea is bizarre, and that's the reality of it. But the reality is created by these articles, and Surkov's genius was to see you can turn politics into a spectacle. So all of people's energy is absorbed by trying to understand what's going on. And of course, as we know in the case of Surkov, he was physically bribing every participant in this fake spectrum. And we see family resemblance between this and certain participants in the Congress. You know, it's a soap opera. It's literally a soap opera. For instance, in the Trump case, we're like, oh, he's not a hero. He's the antithesis of a hero. But we're trying to think, will he get through 91 indictments? Will he do this? Will he do that? So we're forgetting that over there, like people who come from the English culture understand how the pantomime tradition works around Christmas time. You know, the monster is over there. No, he's not. No, he's not. And this is what the media is often creating in our minds, this sense of otherness, that we are other than this, whereas in fact we are participants in our own destiny. This is our democracy. We decide whether we vote for these people, not polls, not these sentiments. But again, it's coming back to, when you see your emotions being manipulated for good or for ill, then you can determine, and MN is in determine as well. You can determine how you're going to act, how are you going to feel to this. So if I see a NAFO meme, North Atlantic Fellow Organization, this organic movement, which I saw the Italian MFA very dryly described yesterday, said, Russian disinformationists used to have free reign to in their manipulation operations, but now an Atlanticist organic movement, which is organized, called the North Atlantic Fellow Organization online, is engaging in Mematic Battles in the information space. And so once we see that, we can decide, okay, is this good? Like many of us will see, who are watching very closely the Ukraine war on a microwave, we might see sometimes people say things which are breaches of international law. Oh, just kill them all, or some, things like that, which we cannot promote or adhere to. That is definitely disinfolklore. But everything which is in adherence with everything else is open space. And if you see that, you know NAFO is defending that. So you hear your emotions being engaged, you promote it, but the other side, you're fighting against that. But the media, I think, perceiving the media as a creator of reality rather than merely reporting it, I think is a great insight.
It's helping to build that pantomime. It's helping to construct the theatre and the comical sort of scenery that goes with that. I mean, to cat sort of that one off, of course, it works on both sides. So people who might be watching this who are more inclined to sort of the MAGA point of view will be saying, ah, yes, but the left is this evil pantomime, and those who are on the sort of center or left will be saying, it's the right who's the evil pantomime. It actually triggers both sides, and it creates a pantomime and reduces the agency of both sides. But it's interesting you mentioned the sort of NAFO bit here, because this feeds into something that I've slowly come to realize is that a lot of propaganda, a lot of anti-propaganda projects and technologies are based on the idea of fact checking. So you look at atomized pieces of information, individual articles, and so on. You don't necessarily go back through the full provenance of the narratives or the history of the writer, etc. You look at this as a sort of disembodied article or piece of work, and then you try to criticize it based on a sort of blow by blow factual kind of critique. That obviously that's an obvious way to do things, and of course it's logical. It slowly dawned on me that this really doesn't work, because disinformation works as a sort of, I call it an ontology. It creates an entire universe of stories, a kind of almost a sort of, I think Ian Garner, who spoke at length on this in our last interview, calls it almost like a sort of Alice through the looking glass world. Once you pass through that, you're in a hall of mirrors, and fact checking simply inserts another mirror into your already distorted view of reality. It's actually adding to the complexity and confusion. It's not actually resolving it. What the NAFO collective does is says, we're not necessarily, gonna create some sophisticated alternative world. What we're gonna do is create a community with a purpose, and that is just sort of whack-a-mole, just creating stuff, creating humor, bashing anything that comes from these sources, and just sort of countering it in this incredible organic way. But it's also creating an entire world, an alternative world in which we can live in, so we don't have to live in that distorted world. And it seems to me that it's no good sort of creating individual counter narratives. You actually have to create an entire alternative universe to live in, to immunize yourself against the distorted universe of Russia's propaganda. But I'd love to hear your sort of take on that.
Yeah, I think the classic definition distinguishes between disinformation and misinformation on the grounds of the intent of the person or the entity creating the message. And this in English criminal law, mens rea, so the mind in the thing, the manner in the thing. But of course, if I consciously try to manipulate you, Jonathan, and then you believing me, then go and speak to your sister about this, I heard X, then you're communicating, and manners and communicate as well. And Mooney, you're communicating the essence of this message, this meme, unintentionally. So you're misinforming, and I'm disinforming. So you're just left in this circular thing. So one of the key elements in counter disinformation and in Disinfolklore and CounterDisinfolklore is that there's this module in there of what I call the code of positive trolls, which is if you proof any particular informational unit against the code of positive trolls. And so there's 6 elements to it. Most is this informational unit, is it generous? Is it ethically disciplined? Is there patience in it? Does it communicate this idea of joyous perseverance? Is it focused, or is it wise? And it's mainly the ethical discipline. The the ends justify the means. In Disinfolklore and CounterDisinfolklore, the ends never justify the means if the means are unethical. And what defines ethical is the post-World War II settlement. So our societies decided after the Holocaust, after Russia and Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War, which obviously is a surprise to many of us because we swallowed the Disinfolklore that Germany started the war. Whereas in fact, as we know, and John, I know you spent a lot of time in Russia, in Ukraine, you see the monuments, 1941 to 1945, and you're like, well, what happened to 1939 and 1940? What were you doing then? Oh, you were with the Nazis. Oh, let's get rid of the bad Nazi term. We'll call Ukrainians Nazis, and we'll create this whole alternative folklore about the far right in Ukraine. That's not true. So in this evaluative framework, you take any informational unit and you decide, so is this generous? It's never generous to cow about someone's death. I mean, it's bad, it's wrong. But the ethically disciplined is set by, we have the Genocide Convention, the consensus of humanity is there, and manners in humanity as well. It's this essence, this light, this energy inside us that people try to manipulate and take. We have the territorial boundaries are sacrosanct, which Russia destroyed in March 2014 when it purported to annex Crimea with its little green men. So we have this whole set of rules, the United Nations, international law, all of these things. That defines what's ethical. And you can say to me, Jonathan, I don't agree with that. Well, I'm like, well, maybe I don't agree with some of the things in there, but that is the settled consensus of humanity. And if we want to judge whether this meme is ethical or not, whether it passes the code of positive trolls, whether it's disinfolklore or folklore, then if it is combating, if it's NAFO, a meme combating the idea that Crimea is Russia, then it is counter-disinfolklore by definition, because Crimea, by law, is part of Ukraine. And that is what sets the ethical discipline. So this is an issue in most, and I've read a lot of it. I spent a couple of years reading everything I could in academic disinformation research. You often see journalists who describe themselves as disinformation specialists themselves are promoting disinformation. And of course, like these things, I can't remember the name, that go through our body, that COVID actually, they're supposed to stop us getting infected and stop us getting bad, but they wreck our immunity, our immune system, and COVID actually colonizes them. Like that, Russist disinfolklorists, they describe themselves, they set themselves up as disinformation journalists. And because there's no evaluative framework to decide, is this disinformation, is it not? Is this disinfolklore, is it not? What is good, what is bad about it? And I don't shy away from the fact that we need to have a working hypothesis of what is, and I take these 6 criteria from Buddhism, where they were used, basically they brought peace to Tibet twice in its history, warring parties, that everything is proofed against these 6 criteria, and I just borrow them and I insert them as a module. And so someone says to me, well, you're creating folklore with your disinfolklore idea. Yes, I am, but actually it's counter-disinfolklore. How can it be counter-disinfolklore? Well, I am defending equality. I'm defending the human rights, the settled consensus of humanity, and everything that we fought and our countries fought World War II for, and everything they are trying to destroy is that, from our social welfare systems to our equality between the sexes, the axis of misogyny. It's in this coercive control imminent in the Russian disinformation. And if an informational unit, the article you're reading, the meme you're looking at, is promoting these bad things, these unethical things, if they're ungenerous, these can all be clues to what it's doing. If it's focused on bad things, then we know we're dealing with disinfolklore. We know we may be on the stage. We think we're watching this play as, oh, will Ukraine win? Will Russia win? Oh, back, forth every day. But actually, we're on the stage, and we're a participant in it on the side of the Russians if we are promoting the disinfolklore. And this happens to me as well. You know, this is my core teaching in all of this, is that the disinformation isn't, and disinfolklore isn't something that happens to other people. We are all susceptible, no matter how brilliant we are. And whenever I hear anyone, including myself, say, "Oh God, you know, I'd never fall for that," you know, pride comes before a fall is a aphorism in our culture for a reason. Literally, the next day, I will read something. I'll be like, "God, that's terrible, absolutely terrible," and then I'll be like, "Oh my God, I've just been trolled." But we can celebrate that and look at why we decided not to donate to this charity or whatever, why our intention changed, why we became sad at reading this New York Times article. And so the humor is generosity, the NAFO humor. And I know for trying to describe NAFO to people who aren't online is pretty difficult, but let's just use the Italian MFA word. They engage in battles and memes, mematic battles, and I see all of these informational units as memes, whether they're visual or audible, in the sounds we say or words. And we're in this warfare in our personal lives, in our lives all the time. But there is this focus of a battle, which many of us are focused on, which is Ukraine. It's not the only war in the world, that we're engaged in because this matters, and we have to look back. You know, that meme, if you ever wondered what you were doing, I think this comes from online. I'm sure you've seen it. Wonder what you do before in the Second World War. Well, you're doing it now, and so many of us are just trying our best to engage in mimetic battles.
And this is interesting. So you're saying let's get beyond the physical words or the container, as it were, of that disinfolklore, and actually look at what it's doing. Is it manipulating your energy? Is it manipulating your willingness or unwillingness to go and do something? Is it dissuading you from doing something that you might have otherwise done? At a very basic level, it is manipulating your agency and energy. And so you start by looking at that and then working backwards to, you know, the physical structure of the language and then trying to piece it into something together. Also, how important is this, that this is a continuous process? Because it seems to me that Russian disinformation is a little bit like a religious catechism. It's or mantra. It's repeated over and over and over again, no matter how nonsensical it might seem. Through sheer weight of repetition, these narratives start to gain some validity. And the fact that you hear them from a voice that's really crude, you don't get taken in by that because I don't believe this particular person, they don't have validity to me. But then you hear that same narrative perhaps repeated in a slightly more refined way by somebody who you would give some credence to. So it clearly works through this kind of amplification and repetition. This is how a lot of Russian internal propaganda works as well. You know, you'll see it in multiple media formats, in almost dressed up in different clothes, and then you'll see it in Telegram, and you think, okay, well, we know that the state media is controlled, but surely not everybody. You know, I've heard lots of different people talking about it. Oh, and now I've gone Telegram, which I know is an organic medium, and it's being repeated there. So it creates this extraordinary kind of echo chamber of multi-tonality, which sucks you in. And yeah, I've seen people take all sorts. You know, they won't believe one narrative, such as the genocide or all Ukrainians are Nazis. Go, well, that clearly is nonsense. But yeah, it is really all the fault of NATO, or maybe there is some deeper, you know, global plot, military industrial plot to take over the world, and maybe Putin didn't launch the war himself, but was manipulated into doing this. There's always a story that will get you. If that one doesn't, then another one will, and they're kind of ubiquitous. So how does the anti-propaganda deal with that? Because this is a real problem, isn't it? Being able to match it, to pump out your positive, action-oriented messages, not just once or twice, but ubiquitously and continuously. I mean, to an extent, that's what my channel's trying to do. That's why we put a video out every single day, because we have to create an alternative reality and we have to repeat it over and over and over and over again to counter the effect of the disinformation.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you use the word mantra, which of course contains two elements, the tra and the man, and with MN and mantra breaks down as mind protector. But this tra is movement. So in early English, this idea of troll the bowl, it's in Shakespeare, it's about pass the bowl, it's about movement. And tra and transport, all of these, trump, troll, all of these words have this sense of movement in them, which is movement of emotions. And I was at that point for a long time, but I was wondering, what is it that moves? And in Old Irish, amauen, A-M-H-A-I-N, or in Latin, manes, the soul, and the mania, or the mothers mourning for the sons of their souls, which is this is the well from which our intentions grow and our motivations grow. And most of us don't have a sense of this subtle energy of which our being and all of our activities is constituted. And if we don't have a sense of that, and of course, in some ways, it's an organizing fiction. I write about it in powerofmana.net, powerofmana, M-A-N.net, but it's a core component in Disinfolklore because it's this, you're allowing trolls or memes to come into your mind, which is again an MN sound, and that is affecting you in some clear way. And if you do not have this, what I call in a posh way, an evaluative framework, in my case, the code of positive trolls, then it's really easy to get disorientated. And if you haven't had the benefit of studying human rights, for instance, or understanding this meaning, and it's in meaning, it shines through, which interestingly comes from two Ukraine educated lawyers. The idea, so Lauterpacht, Hirsch Lauterpacht, who taught law at Cambridge University, was born in Lviv or Lvov at the time, and he wrote a book in 1945 called The Universality of Human Rights. And he's one of those few people in our world who manages to get their individual idea projected into law in a really conservative profession. And out of that came human rights protected as a matter of law in the European Convention of Human Rights. So for instance, if someone says to you, I'm going to abolish human rights, you know immediately the manner what they're doing is unethical. They're trying to manipulate, they're trying to break down this world. And you can see that disguised in any way, shape, or form. They'll talk about, oh, these refugees are all criminals. And again, that MN is in criminal. And we hear that a lot. Trump launched his campaign calling all Mexican immigrants thing, and those involved in the English information space see this rhetoric the whole time. This is this core boundary, inner outer realm making rhetoric. But if we understand that there is a human right to seek asylum from persecution, from when you have a well-founded fear in your mind of being persecuted, this is a human right established after the Second World War, then you know any rhetoric which is in any way, shape, or form telling you to surrender to the idea of killing these people or beating them with drones, as some of the Republicans in America have talked about, or Trump. It's in almost every Trump speech about the bloodline. Again, this folkloric idea of poisoning of the bloodstream. Then we have this guidance system inside us. So hopefully, when we get these sensory inputs that we may feel emotionally positive about, maybe we lost our job to an immigrant and we're angry about it, or to if we're a male, to a woman. And so the idea that we can have, put all the women in what's her name, Margaret Atwood's book, which is basically what many of the far right want to do. They want to recreate this patriarchal society. But if we have this guidance system, what I call the code of proof, any meme against, and we learn as a habit, and this is where the mantra comes in, that the repetition, it's a mnemonic, other MN word. And these mnemonics, we live by them all the time, to remember to look at our phone, to look at Google Maps when we're going, to check the time, all of these little mnemonics we have all the time. So it's a matter of inserting some new ones in there. For instance, check, check, check. Is this ethical? Is it ethical to drown these people in the English Channel? For instance, probably not. And therefore, any message which is in any way justifying this, we know is wrong. And that hopefully will help us cut through this confusion that is, and this is the essence of disinfolklore, which is to assess these stories we read, whether they're on the news, which itself is creating this folklore, this which we as community members commune through this idea of it, of the news. You know, I say, "Oh, did you see the news today?" And you say, "Oh, yes, I did." Like what, that Beckett, Waiting for Godot, you know, two old men chatting about something, and we have something to chat about. Then, if we have this way of cutting through all of that to working out, am I being manipulated in a way that is against my interest, against our civilization's interest, against what on a cold, on a sunny day I would be really against? Then we know, then we just have a tool to get through the mantra. And so, yeah, it's fighting mantra with mantra. And hopefully I can tell the stories in disinfolklore.net which engage people on a daily basis. So I'm responding to stimulus that I have. I wouldn't have got here without X and X's algorithm, which is trolling me, the constantly hitting me with this stuff, or with NAFO, or with your own content. In Garner, it was really good. Jade McGlynn, brilliant. It was great hearing Alexander Weinman, except for one element in what he said, but I won't repeat it here because it'll depress the spirits. So, but anyway, yeah.
And interesting, I mean, just to sort of, there's one more question, but just to sort of summarize here, I think what this requires, I mean, the disinfolklore or the anti-disinfolklore, which is targeting Russian narratives, you're saying here it only works because it's not just, you know, meeting myth with myth, that actually it comes from a place of values. So it has to have a foundation of certain values and certain commonly held positions. For instance, you know, killing someone and violating the sovereignty of a country is wrong. So there's certain universally accepted values that may not all be accepted of the people, let's say in the NATO army, but there's a core, at least, of values that most people could sign up to. You're saying that is essential to have a deep well of common values. Whereas you compare that to propaganda, it is by its very nature, Russian propaganda might put on the clothes of a particular morality, but if we look at it in its entirety, it is fundamentally amoral. It has no particular moral position. It's designed to divide or erode, divide and conquer on the one hand, but also to erode your own belief in your core values. So we're looking at two very different things that are superficially adopting maybe some of the same techniques, but they're coming from a very, very different place and a different intent as well.
Yeah, well, I think I looked at this question for quite some time, which is what unifies ideologically English, American, French oligarchs with Russian oligarchs? What do they talk about? What do they share? So it's not these are very smart people. And I found it actually in a piece written by a guy called Pat Buchanan, and he called it Putin's Paleo Conservative Moment in December 2013. And in it, Pat Buchanan, who invented the cultural war political strategy for conservatives in 1991 with a declaratory speech, he said, there is a cultural war. And with that, that sparked oodles of academic research about a cultural war between traditionalist conservatives, family values, masculinists, and what they put as transgressors. Again, this TRA word. So when we see this trans debate, what I hear in this is transgressor. That's what's being inculcated in the mind of people with a particular psychological inventory called writ-wing authoritarian, this is work which was done by Altmaier after the Second World War to try and work out why did people follow Hitler, not looking at the leaders. But these people, they were very highly conventional, and they will defend their idea, what their leaders say is conventional. So transgressors of rules are anathema to them. They see women's rights as the end of a peace. It's the thin end of the wedge. All chaos will come, and so they'll defend it. And these are the people who invaded the capital. And of course, they're being manipulated consciously by people who understand exactly what I'm talking about, because Pat Buchanan, for instance, invented this stuff and advised Trump. And what unites these people, and this is where you get to values, is this paleo-masculinist view of the world. They want to return us to the pre-World War II settlement. And so I try not to talk too much about values, because I think it's quite alien from people, and because I'm a lawyer by training. So I'm just focusing on the post-World War II order, the UN Charter, the right to self-defense, inviolability of territorial boundaries, the Genocide Convention, all of the equality, the various international instruments looking for equality between the sexes, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all of these. So the battle space for me is very clearly, and this is immanent in everything disinfolklore is, and what it's countering is what Russia did, say, in Crimea by breaching territorial boundaries, breach this post-World War II settlement. What it does when it does these horrific things that unfortunately have entered our minds from, and I know, Jonathan, you will have seen the minutiae of what occupation means. This isn't just a nice transfer of people and about rules and laws. It's horrific, the coercion. And I'm sure someone like you who understands Russia and loves Russia is just like, it's just horrible that to see what is being done in the name of what is a great culture. So anyway, so so it's legal. These values are enshrined in law, and everything that these people, whether they're on our side, whether they're in England or in America, are together with the Russians in terms of getting rid of LGBTIQ, getting rid of female emancipation, getting rid of the sacrosanct of territorial bound. They want might is right. President Trump said it the other day, and this was what President Biden said. You wouldn't believe this in a novel, where he said, I'm going to get rid of all rules, regulations, and the US Constitution. He's going to become a monarch. Again, he wants the manna of the community to reside in himself, not in we, the people. And so when we talk about values, I think in terms of these laws, the European Convention of Human Rights enshrines them, the defense of it. And someone says, oh, but we can't export the refugees unless we get out of it. And we're like, exactly, this is ground zero of the battle which I'm talking about, which is imminent in this fight that Ukraine is fighting against Russia to defend these values, literally. But and all of us are fighting these values. But it's also a way of seeing, cutting through disinfolklore and distinguishing between disinfolklore and counter-disinfolklore, is that if that story, I met this, my friend met someone who met an immigrant, and they just arrived in the country and they got a house in the Cotswolds, and now they get £300 a week and they've got a car. And, this kind of disinfolklore, which is motivating us to think, okay, let's get out of the European Convention of Human Rights. This is the same battle that Ukraine is fighting in there. This is why people like Elon Musk are on the side of the paleo conservatives. They don't want any constraint on their power. They don't want human rights for their workers. They, like Henry VIII, they don't want Rome to be impacted. They don't want international law to be impacting on municipal law. And so for me, and this is imminent in disinfolklore and counter-disinfolklore, this is the primary battle of our age. And as Pat Buchanan put it he quoted Putin as saying that our battle today, maybe the battle is not between East and West now. The battle is in each of our countries between what they call this transnational elite. And again, it's this word and we know the trans debate and all of that stuff. And it's not a debate, the attempt to mobilize anti-equality rhetorics to discriminate against one part of our community using the word transgressors. They're transgressing the rules that
Those
we.
who are other, it's those who are, it's creating artificial sometimes differences or exacerbating real life differences to alienate you from people who otherwise you might find some commonality with.
Absolutely, and the cosmopolitan elites. So there are many people in our community and who are probably watching this thinking, well, I believe in family values. I run my house in this particular way, and that's all fine. But there are certain constraints which were established as law after the Second World War that we can agree on, that territorial integrity, women and equal rights to access to education, to healthcare, to what these are settled not only as a matter of law, but they're the settled values of our community. And the people we're fighting against are the people who are trying to destroy these rights. We see it literally in Ukraine, where in the occupied territory, these places where I spent a lot of time, there is no water, there is no education, books are being there's no right to participate in public decision making, and all of these things. So this, for me, is the battle, and Disinfolklore and CounterDisinfolklore is my small contribution to helping arm us. Munition, it's a munition, amen, to give us to fight against this, which for us it was the battle in 1939 to 1945, and here we are again. Yeah.
And these kind of tools are absolutely what's required now. I mean, the actual reason I created this channel was actually the realization that in Ukraine there are methodologies. People are developing immunities to the disease of these sort of viral meme-based disinformation, and it's not complete. It doesn't provide complete immunity, but it's not going to completely cripple you or kill you if you're able to deploy some of these techniques that are being developed in Ukraine. And it was the immediacy of, I believed, us needing to understand that Ukraine has something we need. I still see it in that way. And one of my arguments of why we should support Ukraine to win is quite a self-interested argument, and it's based on the idea of genetic diversity. And that is, well, why are we, saving plants from the rainforest? Well, because they might contain a genetic code for a molecule or a compound which could benefit us in future. I see the same as Ukraine. Ukraine is a laboratory of techniques for counting disinformation. If we allow Ukraine to disappear as an entity, that is a kind of set of learnings for us. That is a set of immunities or techniques which we could benefit from in future if we have more time to study them and emulate them. But we won't be able to do that if it's sort of taken over. So this is a sort of one of the arguments I'm sort of deploying there. The work you're doing is absolutely fascinating. I really hope you get the opportunity to explore it once again. I encourage people to reach out to you and check out your website if they are curious about the methodology, and if they are in some professional context, want to understand more about the nuts and bolts of it, how they could deploy it in their organization, or to help immunize their teams or give them a framework for trying to understand disinformation, whether it be political, commercial, social, whatever. I strongly encourage them to get in contact. But Stephen, thank you so much for sharing so much of your inspiration and insight with us today.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your amazing work creating this alternative sense of reality here. I love your chat, so it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome to my world. Thanks so much. It's brilliant.